Welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm Brittany Wen, and I am the Assistant Commissioner of User Experience for our Data and Research team at the Utah System of Higher Education, which includes the Utah Data Research Center. So I'll be your host today for the webinar. Today we're talking about the post-secondary and workforce outcomes for Utah's charter high school students. And our senior research scientist is Karen Tao, who worked on this report, and she'll be sharing with us some of the report's main findings. So first, a few administrative details before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online at UDRC's website, so you can reference this later by finding it there afterwards. We'll spend about the first 45 minutes talking about the report, and then we'll have time for questions at the end for about 10 to 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function so we can easily find them. You'll find that Q&A button at the bottom bar of the webinar. So I'll be asking some of my own questions to Karen throughout this session, and then we'll reserve talking about the questions we receive from all of you at the end. And then also we have the chat function open because we like to hear from all of you, and so our participants can get a feel of who is in the webinar with us. So for all of you who are here today, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You can simply put in your name, job title, and the organization you're from. You're also welcome to share anything else about yourself or make any comments. Also, if you want to share any relevant resources or links about the topic we're talking about today, so charter schools, you can do that as well. So your own research if you want, because we like to hear from our peers and what you guys are working on as well. And then also, if you're new to the Utah Data Research Center, we're also known as UDRC. We are the state longitudinal data system for Utah. We connect state administrative data on K through 12, post-secondary education, employment, and health. We conduct meaningful research to inform public policy initiatives and help policymakers, practitioners, and the public make data-informed decisions. So we provide original research reports along with interactive data narratives, and we also accept data requests from external researchers. And then finally, we host public webinars such as this one and other events to showcase our research. You can learn more about us at udrc.ushi.edu. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Karen Tao. She is currently a senior research scientist at UDRC, and previously she was with the Unemployment Insurance Division at the Utah Department of Workforce Services. She holds a master's in data science from the University of Helsinki, and some of her other UDRC projects include the STEM student outcomes and the gender wage gap of post-secondary graduates in Utah. So I'll pass it on to Karen now to share more about herself and introduce us to today's topic.
Thank you, Brittany. My research at the UDRC typically involves subsets of students who are underrepresented. So for example, STEM students. Another research from a few years ago is that we looked at students from low-income families. So when the topic of charter school students came up, I was interested in learning more about who these students are and what their outcomes are. So for this research, we'll be looking at charter high school students specifically. And we first want to find out the enrollment rates at Utah public post-secondary institutions among high school graduates. And also, among the students who enrolled, what's the percentage of them who complete a degree or certificate within USHE? And we're also interested in the amount of time it takes for students to enroll at a USHE institution, as well as the amount of time it takes for students to complete their degree or certificate at USHE. Now, with DWS data, we can study students' workforce attachment and their wages after they leave education. And finally, using a statistical matching technique, we'll be looking at the relationship between charter high school attendance and these various outcomes that we just talked about. So before we move on to share our findings, I think it's important to define the scope of this study. Because our data sources are USBE, USHE, and DWS, we're looking at students who attended a high school in Utah, attended an institution in USHE, and had Utah wages. So more specifically, These are students who went to a high school in Utah, whether that is a charter high school or a non-charter high school. And this data came from USBE. Then with USHE data, we'll be looking at students who attended a Utah public post-secondary institution. Just to put things into perspective, according to the Utah High School Feedback Report, about 51% of the USBE graduates attend a post-secondary institution. And among those 51%, about 80% of them attend a USHE institution. Finally, with DWS data, we could look at students' workforce outcome that includes their workforce attachment and also their annual wages. So this brings us to look at whom this study does not include. Now, as we're using USHE data for post-secondary education, that means we do not have post-secondary data for students who attended an in-state private institution. So for example, BYU or Westminster. We also do not have post-secondary data for students who attended out-of-state institutions. So basically, we do not have data on students who left Utah for further education. And similarly, we do not have wage data for students who left Utah for employment. And even for those who had Utah wages, DWS records do not include self-employment, federal employees, some nonprofit employees, or students who may have chosen not to work or did not work for other reasons.
Got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing that to help us keep in mind what your research shares and what it doesn't include. Could you also share with us a snapshot of the main findings before we go on into the details of all your data?
Absolutely. First, we can talk about students' post-secondary readiness. Charter high school students earned twice as many CE credits and 3 times as many AP credits compared to non-charter high school students, though they had a slightly lower high school graduation rate. And when we look at post-secondary outcomes, charter high school students had lower USHE enrollment rates and USHE graduation rates, although they enrolled in a USHE institution sooner and completed their degrees or certificates sooner. They also had a lower post-secondary GPA on average. Now, finally, students who attended a charter high school had weaker workforce attachment and lower average annual wages compared to students who never attended a charter high school.
It looks like you were able to do a very comprehensive study, being able to look at many different types of post-secondary and workforce outcomes, as you showed here, and be able to contrast them between charter and non-charter high school students. So it's great that we can do these kinds of studies at UDRC where we're able to connect a lot of state data to give us insights that we may not have been able to get in the past. So it's great that this study provides this information. So let's go ahead and talk about the sample of students you used and some of the demographics that comprises each student group.
Yeah, let's do that. So the sample for this study includes USBE cohort years from 2012 to 2021, and we're looking at grade levels between 9 and 12. That means we're only looking at charter high school students. And in this study, that is defined as a student who had attended a Utah charter high school at some point during the high school years. And when we looked at the amount of time that these students were in charter high schools, among students who had attended charter high school, the median length of attendance was between 1 to 2 years. And finally, our non-charter high school students are the students who had not attended a charter high school in Utah during the high school years. So our sample included 426,095 USB high school students, with charter high school students making up about 12% and non-charter high school students making up about 88%. And this is consistent with the USBE data report for the 2025 cohort, which they reported 12% of the USBE student body were charter school students. So now let's look at who the high school students are using descriptive statistics from USBE. So what we noticed was that the percentage of underrepresented students increased from 2012 to 2021 for both charter and non-charter high schools. White students in charter high schools decreased from 82.7% in 2012 to 73% in 2021, which is a sharper decline compared to non-charter high schools, which went from 78.4% in 2012 to 73.9% in 2021. For Hispanic students, and you can follow along on the graph here, we see that Hispanic students in charter high schools increased from 10.4% in 2012 to 17.9% in 2021. So that's the yellow line on the graph. And Hispanic students in non-charter high schools also had an increase from 14.6% in 2012 to 17.9% in 2021. And that is the blue line on the graph. Now let's look at the descriptive statistics using USBE data on how the demographic makeup has changed over time. So on your left is the representation of the changes in charter high schools, and on your right is the representation of the changes in non-charter high schools. And we see that white students had an overall decrease in the percentages from 2012 to 2021. And when you look at the rest of the categories, for most of them, for example, Hispanic students, students of color, English learners, immigrants, refugees, students with a disability, we're seeing an increase in the percentages of students in these groups over time.
So yeah, that's interesting. You're seeing increases for these underrepresented student groups in charter high schools. And we can see this in these charts that if the yellow or blue dots are on the right of the dumbbell visual, it means there was an increase over time. While if the color dot is on the left side of the dumbbell, it means it decreased. So for the underrepresented students, why do you think we're seeing these increases?
Well, overall, we see that the increase in underrepresented students are actually consistent with the changes in the general USBE student body. But we also want to keep in mind that some charter high schools are targeting certain groups. So for example, refugees and immigrants.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good to know. So now that we know more about the student composition, let's dive into their educational outcomes. I saw in your report that you looked at their high school graduation rates and their AP and concurrent enrollment trends to determine their post-secondary readiness or college preparedness. What did you find there?
When we looked at post-secondary readiness using descriptive statistics from USBE, we see that charter high school students had a slightly lower high school graduation rate at 82.5% compared to non-charter high school students at 87.9%. And looking at their coursework, the rate of charter high school students taking CE courses was comparable to non-charter high school students, while a higher percentage of charter high school students were taking AP credits than non-charter high school students. And the interesting pattern we see is highlighted in the graph on your right. So among students who earned CE credits, charter high school students were earning 45 CE credits on average compared to non-charter high school students who were earning 22 CE credits on average. So that is the top portion of the graph. And then at the bottom, we see that for students who earned AP credits, charter high school students were earning 3 AP credits on average compared to 1 AP credit earned by non-charter high school students on average.
Yeah, so it sounds like overall, charter high school students had more post-secondary readiness than non-charter students, considering how much college credit they were earning in high school. I'm curious to hear how that translates for them once they enter college. What did their post-secondary outcomes tell you from your study?
So let's now look at some descriptive statistics from USHE for students' post-secondary outcomes. So the graph on your left shows the enrollment and completion rates at USHE. So among high school graduates, 35% of the charter high school students enrolled at a USHE institution, compared to 43% of the non-charter high school students. And among students who enrolled at USHE, 25% of the charter high school students completed their degree or certificate program as of the time that this study was conducted, compared to 31% of the non-charter high school students. And when we look at the average time to students' first USHE enrollment, and that is the time between their high school graduation to their first USHE enrollment, this is shown in the middle graph. The top part is for degree granting institutions. So charter high school students were enrolling in 8 months on average, compared to non-charter high school students 9 months. Then at the bottom of the graph, we're showing time to enrollment at a USHE technical college. Charter high school students were enrolling in 12 months at a USHE technical college, compared to a non-charter high school student 16 months on average. So the pattern is that for students who do enroll at a USHE institution, they enroll sooner, though the enrollment rate is lower. Now, on your right, this is a graph that shows the USHE average GPA. Charter high school students earned a 2.56 GPA on average, compared to non-charter high school students at 2.70. So now let's look at students' USHE completion timelines. Something to keep in mind when we're looking at this slide is that we included USBE cohort year 2021 in our sample. So that means the students we included may still be on their path to earning a degree or certificate. So let's keep that in mind when looking at the completion rates here. And something else that I wanted to point out is that if a student had initially enrolled at a USHE institution, but later transferred to or graduated from a private institution or an out-of-state post-secondary institution, we would not have captured that student's graduation on this slide. So out of all of the students who enrolled at a USHE institution, 30.4% received at least one award. Focusing on charter high school students, 25% who enrolled completed the degree or certificate, compared to 31% of the non-charter high school students. For degree granting institutions, the average months from the first USHE enrollment to the first USHE degree is 34.6 months on average. For charter high school students, that is 35.7 months to a degree at a DGI, compared to non-charter high school students, 34.1 months on average. And then for students who enrolled in technical colleges, the overall average time to certificate is 34.4 months. And for charter high school students, that's 35 months on average, compared to non-charter high school students, 34.4 months on average.
Yeah, that's interesting that charter students had shorter degree completion times compared to non-charter students, like you said. I wonder if that's because they had earned a lot more concurrent enrollment and AP college credit in high school, and that helped them get ahead if they did enroll in a USHE institution. So either way, we can see that difference there between charter and non-charter students. Did you notice any difference in the outcomes by award level?
Yes, we analyzed the highest educational attainment for the students. So that means for each of the students who completed a degree or a certificate, we find the highest educational attainment, and then we group the students by their highest educational attainment. So what's interesting here is that a higher percentage of charter high school students were earning bachelor's degrees compared to non-charter high school students. Now, in other degree or certificate categories, we see some differences of less than 1%, with the exception in associate degrees. So it is notable that a higher percentage of charter high school students were earning bachelor's degrees, while a higher percentage of non-charter high school students were earning associate degrees.
Yeah, that's interesting that there's that difference there between charter and non-charter students, the types of degrees they're going for. It seems like this is another indicator that charter students have a higher level of post-secondary readiness. to complete longer degrees if they do enroll in college. So that was a great overview about their post-secondary outcomes. Let's switch gears and talk about their workforce outcomes. I know it's pretty nuanced in how you looked at workforce attachment and wages. Can you explain the workforce data you used and then share some of your main results?
Sure. So the wage data we used came from DWS, Department of Workforce Services. And we collected wage data up to the last quarter of 2021. And if a student had wages from multiple employers in the same quarter, we summed the wages so that we had the student's quarterly wage. And for this study, we approximate a workforce attachment status called strongly attached to the workforce. We do this by multiplying 7.25, the federal minimum wage per hour, by 40 hours a week, multiply by 52 weeks per year, then divide by 4 quarters per year to arrive at 3770 as a threshold that students must meet in order to be considered strongly attached to the workforce for that one quarter. Now, once we have this approximate for each quarter, the student must be strongly attached to the workforce all 4 quarters of the year to be considered strongly attached to the workforce that year. So it is also important to consider the timeline of employment. If a student does not have post-secondary enrollment, we looked at their wage outcomes after their high school graduation. Otherwise, if a student had post-secondary enrollment, we looked at their wage outcomes after their last post-secondary enrollment or completion. Now, this is done so that we ensure students are available for their workforce attachment. And we're not looking at wage outcomes while students may be still focusing on their academic pursuits. So the next slide looks at workforce attachment. 43% charter high school students had Utah wages 1 year after leaving education, compared to 50% of the non-charter high school students. So that's on the graph. And if we look at their wages, charter high school students earned $15,118 per year on average, compared to non-charter high school students at $16,700 per year on average. So these are just students who had wages in Utah that year. And then if we apply the strongly attached to the workforce condition, meaning students who were approximated to be full-time year-round employees, charter high school students were earning $32,883 per year on average, compared to non-charter high school students $34,402 per year on average. And on that next slide, this is the graph that shows us the average annual wages for charter high school students and non-charter high school students after their education for up to 5 years. For students who had Utah wage records. So looking at the graph, the yellow lines represent the charter high school students and the dark blue lines represent the non-charter high school students. And in each year, we see that charter high school students earned lower annual wages than their non-charter high school peers. And the trend also shows that the annual wages grow over time for both groups. And if we look at the difference between these two groups of students each year, we see that the difference gets smaller and smaller over time. And this may suggest that as students spend more time in the workforce and become further removed from their education, whether they attended a charter high school may play a diminishing role in their annual wages.
Can you explain more about those wages and the workforce attachment you mentioned on the previous slide? Why are charter high school students earning lower wages and have a lower workforce attachment compared to non-charter students?
We're highlighting the difference in students' workforce attachment and their annual wages, but we don't really have the data behind the reasons that charter high school students had different wage outcomes compared to non-charter high school students. Some of this could be due to students moving out of state and therefore they don't have Utah wage records. And some of this could be students choosing not to work Or maybe charter high school students became self-employed and do not show up in DWS data. So we simply do not have the data needed to investigate the reason for the difference.
I see. Yeah, thanks for explaining that further. And it's a good reminder of the limitations we have with the data. Okay, so you've given us the rundown on workforce outcomes and post-secondary outcomes by the descriptive statistics. You also did an analysis using statistical modeling. What was the analysis you did and those main findings?
So the statistical model used for this study is propensity score matching. And the advantage of using a propensity score matching technique is that we can control for students' demographic backgrounds. So we would first calculate propensity scores. And this is the first formula you see on the screen. A propensity score is a probability, and in this case, the probability that a student attended a charter high school, given that student's demographic background, which is the X that you see in the formula. So this X is a vector that represents the student's demographic background information we got from USBE. Those include their immigration status, refugee status, disability status, English learner status, low-income status, sex, and race. And once we calculate the propensity score for each student, we can calculate a weight using a method called inverse probability weighting. The intuition is that if a student has a high probability of attending a charter high school, but they did not, they carry more weight because they may give us some information. Or if a student has a low probability of attending a charter high school, but they did attend, that student may also tell us more information, so they should get more weight. So finally, we calculate what is called the ATE, or average treatment effect, using the weights. Now, this is the second formula you see on the slide. And in this study, the treatment variable is charter high school attendance. And we looked at the outcomes that we already talked about using descriptive statistics. So those are the USU enrollment rates, USU graduation rates, time to USU enrollment, time to USU graduation, USU GPA, workforce attachment, and annual wages. And the ATE is essentially looking at the difference between the weighted average of these outcomes between charter high school students and non-charter high school students. And on the next slide, we have a common support graph on your right. And this is simply the kernel density estimate plots for both charter high school students and charter high school students. What we're looking at is the overlapping area of these plots. The more overlap, the better the model is. And as we can see here on the graph, the two plots are overlapping pretty well. So the model is doing what it's supposed to do. And then on your left are some of the model's findings. So attending a charter high school is associated with a 6.2% lower likelihood of becoming a USU student. And for the USU students, charter high school attendance is associated with a 6.1 lower likelihood of graduating from USU. And the next slide shows us the model findings for more outcomes, post-secondary outcomes. So looking at this graph from left to right, attending a charter high school is associated with 1% higher likelihood of earning AP credits, 2.6% lower likelihood of earning CE credits, 6.2% less likely to enroll at a USU institution. Charter high school attendance is also linked to enrolling in USU 7.9 months sooner and having a USU GPA that is 0.14 lower and a 6.1 lower likelihood of completing a degree or certificate at USU. And finally, students who completed their degree or certificate, they did so in about 2 months sooner.
Yeah, those are interesting findings. So in summary, they're quicker to enroll and graduate quicker from a UC institution. Does this include both degree granting institutions and technical colleges, or is it just some of them?
Yeah, so this includes both degree granting institutions and technical colleges. So the outcome that you see on this slide are post-secondary outcomes from UC.
Okay, got it. Thanks for explaining that more. So what about their workforce outcomes in your model? How do they contrast to non-charter students?
So the next slide shows us the model findings for students' workforce outcomes. Looking at the findings on this slide, this is for students who showed up in Utah DWS data. So just anyone with wage records. So the model finds that charter high school attendance is associated with up to a 3% lower probability of earning Utah wages in the first 5 years after leaving education. And for the students who had Utah wages, the average effects on annual wages declined over time. And on the right, you can see how the difference in the average annual wages changed over time. Now, as the graph increases, it is getting closer and closer to zero if you look at the y-axis. So that means the difference between the wages earned by charter high school students and non-charter high school students is getting closer and closer to zero. And in other words, the gap between these two groups of students shrink over time. And by the 5th year, the average effect of charter high school attendance is $835 per year. Then on the next slide, we'll be looking at students who were strongly attached to the workforce. So that means the students who met the 3770 threshold for all 4 quarters of the year. So charter high school attendance is associated with a 3% lower likelihood of strongly attached to the workforce within the first 5 years after leaving education. And this is similar to the previous slide. And among students who were strongly attached, we're seeing the average effect of annual wages decline over time also. So similar to what we saw in the previous slide, you see this graph going up, increasing, getting closer and closer to zero. So it's important to point out that on this graph, by the 5th year, the average effect of charter high school attendance is $277 per year.
All right, so your modeling is showing a lower likelihood of earning wages and having a lower likelihood of strong workforce attachment, similar to what you showed us in the descriptive statistics of having lower rates of workforce attachment and lower wages. So I think that's something to think about more for charter schools and how they're ensuring their curriculum structure supports not only graduation and going to college, but how that translates into the workforce as well. All right, so thank you to Karen for walking us through her study and going over the data and main findings. She did great at working with so much data to find those outcomes and making this a unique study that we haven't had before about Utah charter students. And Karen shared some of these at the beginning of the presentation when we were talking about the scope of the study, but I'm going to repeat them here in case anyone missed them. So as a reminder, the study does not include students who attended an in-state private post-secondary institution, such as BYU or Westminster, or if they attended an out-of-state post-secondary institution, they were also not in the data. If they left Utah for employment or further education or any other reason, they would not be in the data. Also, if a student was working in Utah, but they're self-employed or they're a federal employee or some certain nonprofit employees, they wouldn't show up in the data. Also, they could choose not to work, or they might have passed away or changed their social security number. There's many different reasons why they might not show up in the data. And then there was also a limitation about the wage records. Karen, could you explain more about that?
Oh, sure. So something about DWS data is that we do not get the number of hours worked in the wage data. And this is an important variable because it could be used to approximate year-round full-time employment. So since we don't have that data, we address this limitation with the 3770 per quarter estimate that we mentioned earlier to approximate students' workforce attachment status. And it is important that we're comparing the wages for students with similar attachment to the workforce. And that's why we had the two different groups of students, the ones who showed up in Utah wages and the ones who had strong attachment to the Utah workforce.
Got it. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, that's often a question we get about our data on why we don't report hours worked or their full-time or part-time status. So our data limits us in that way. So before we enter our Q&A session, let's recap with your final takeaways from the research.
All right, so here are the final takeaways. When we compare post-secondary readiness, charter high school students earned twice as many CE credits and 3 times as many AP credits, though they had a slightly lower high school graduation rate. And when we look at post-secondary outcomes, charter high school students had a lower USU enrollment rate and a lower USU graduation rate, but they were enrolling in USU institutions sooner and completing their degrees or certificates sooner, though they had a slightly lower post-secondary GPA. And finally, for workforce outcomes, charter high school students had weaker workforce attachment and lower average annual wages.
Great, thanks, Karen. So this report is a great resource for helping us ask more questions on how to improve the schooling experience and design better systems, whether it's a charter high school or a non-charter high school. So for educators, you can reflect on how well they are preparing their students to not just graduate, but to succeed in college and in their careers. This could include intentional support systems and inclusive curriculum design with those post-secondary and workforce outcomes in mind. For policymakers, these findings show the importance of accountability and transparency and the need for continued data-driven oversight and ensuring that funding and resources are supporting all students. And then finally, the study is a good reminder to parents to explore whether the school offers robust academic support and access to advanced coursework and clear pathways to college or career success. So to learn more, you can find the full report and data narrative at udrc.uc.edu, and you'll see it featured on the homepage. And Rebecca shared it in the chat as well, a direct link to the data narrative. If you go to our homepage, you can click on publications and you'll see that project at the top of the list. When you click on the project link, it takes you to our data narrative where you can see a screenshot of it here on the left. So that's what it looks like. We have several interactive charts and graphs on there that you can play with, different filters, so you can see the different components of the data that we share today. And then on the bottom right of the data narrative, there is a button that you can click on for Report PDF to download and view the full report. You can see the report screenshot on the right. So this is where you can get more in-depth about the literature review, research methods, data, and all the findings. Okay, so let's start our Q&A, and we could check to see if we have any submitted questions, and we do have a few. So Karen, first question is from Tom Choi. Actually, he has a few. So his first question was, do you not have access to ECHS application data? You could have implemented RCT for the applicants.
That is a really good question. As part of this study, we actually also looked at early college, high school performance, their college readiness. And what we were finding, it was really interesting because when we looked into post-secondary enrollment rates, for example, we were finding them to be artificially low among those who attended early college, high schools. And that is part of the appendix in the actual report itself. So what that suggests is, as I have mentioned earlier, that we don't have access to post-secondary data for students who attended private institutions or out-of-state post-secondary institutions. So we could speculate that these students might have moved out of state or they may have attended private institutions in Utah. But again, we do not have the actual data to back up that claim. However, just from the fact that they took a lot of AP credits and CE credits, but then they did not show up in USHI data, it is an estimate that they may have attended somewhere else.
Got it. Okay, great. This next question was about where can I check the variables used for matching?
Oh, that is a great question. So the matching formula itself is in the actual report, and the variables themselves are, well, first of all, we have the charter variable, which is just a binary 1 or 0, 1 meaning a student attended a Utah charter high school, 0 meaning not. And then the rest of them are demographic background information, and those variables came from USBE. So those are the immigrant status, refugee status, low income status, students with a disability, and then race and sex.
Great. Okay, yeah, so you can check out the report online to get more information on that. The next question was asking about why you may not have looked at OOS and private colleges using NSC data.
You know what? I would have loved NSC data for this research and for all of our research, but unfortunately, out-of-state and private college data are not available in the UDRC data warehouse as of the time that this research was conducted. So that's why they were not included. So what we did was we looked into USHI data, just Utah public post-secondary institutions. Just keep in mind, right, our colleagues at the data team also did provide support on Utah High School Feedback Report. And using their data, we're seeing that about 51% of the Utah high school graduates attend post-secondary institutions. And then among those 51%, about 80% of them attended a USHI institution. So the coverage is actually decent there. But of course, missing data is missing data, and we would love to have more data if we could get our hands on it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Next question is asking, why did you not look at graduation by post-secondary type? So like 2 years and 4 years. DE participation has differential impact on 2-year and 4-year college going and completion.
So we did not look at graduation that way because we, well, first of all, we had to separate the degree granting institutions and the technical colleges so that we could have certificate data and degree data. And with that, like there was one slide where we showed students by their highest educational attainment. So we did look into that just with the data that we had. And yeah, but we were not separating the degrees by 2 or 4 years or by the institutions.
Got it. Okay. The next question is about workforce outcome analysis. Does it use all students regardless of their post-secondary enrollment and completion status?
Yes. So what we were looking at, yeah, so remember at the beginning, we talked about the sample size being 426,000 and about 91 more students. So for all of those students, we looked at whether or not they attended a post-secondary institution. If not, then we looked at their wage outcomes right after high school because we assumed that they would be participating in the workforce, but that is an assumption. Then for those who did attend post-secondary institution in Utah, then what we did was looking at their very last enrollment or completion, and then take the time after that to look at their wage outcomes. So yes, in general, yes, that workforce outcome study looked at all of the students in this study. It's just different timelines that we looked at.
Got it. Great. And then there was a question about are concurrent enrollment AP credits measured in semester credit hours or quarter credit hours?
And that would be in semester credit hours, but that is a great question. Great distinction.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Tom, for those questions. Great details getting into the data. So we have a question from Robert Warren. Have the in-state private schools like BYU and Westminster, have they been approached about providing data? The impact of that data could be very interesting.
I agree that the impact of that data could be very interesting. I am not in a position to answer the first question of have they been approached about providing data. But I do want to point out, looking back at high school feedback report that's prepared by Yushi at our colleagues, the majority, so 80% of those who enroll post-secondarily in Utah went to a USHI institution. So that is the majority of them. And another thing is that although we're missing the private institution data, this limitation applies to both the charter high school students and non-charter high school students. So you would expect that they probably were impacted similarly, unless we're talking about early college high school students.
Okay, great. Yeah, so they weren't approached for this specific study, but perhaps in the future, that's something that could be possible. All right, Brooke Anderson has a question about when comparing charter versus non-charter students statewide, is it worthwhile to account for school locale? So urban, rural, suburban, etc.
That is a really good question because during this research, looking at literature reviews, so previous literature, actually, there are quite a few that looked at the locale. And what's interesting about the charter high schools in Utah, for example, in our appendix, I also had a map of where charter high school students were most concentrated, and that happens to be Utah County and southern side of Salt Lake County, so like Lehigh and Harriman area. Not sure if that contributed to difference in their outcomes, but that was something that we also looked at.
Awesome. Yeah, so yeah, great question. And as Karen said, there is a map about geography that's in the report in the appendix. Okay, let's see. Another question comes from Ryan Haggy. Did you find any meaningful summative data indicating where our non-USHI and workforce students were doing?
So our non-USHI students, non-USHI and workforce students. So I'm guessing you mean students who did not show up in USHI data and also did not show up in the workforce data. So if that's the case, we actually would not have, we would not have the data to back up why or what they're doing. There could be guesses. So for example, self-employment being one of them, that would have taken them out of DWS data, and also maybe they were pursuing being an entrepreneur and not attending a post-secondary institution. Another thing could be they may have moved out of state. We don't know, because if they're out of state, they would not have shown up in USHI data or DWS data. So there are a number of guests that we could talk about here. So yeah, we do not have any indication of what they may be doing.
Got it. Yeah, but some ideas of what possibly could be happening there that you shared. Great. Some other questions I had was, so we talked about charter students are taking a lot of college credits in high school, but it appears that they're not performing as well in their overall post-secondary outcomes. I was wondering if you had any insight on that, like what the disconnect is happening there.
You are right in that charter high school students were earning more AP and CE credits, as we saw earlier, on average, compared to their non-charter high school peers. For those who did earn AP or CE credits. So bringing back the question about early college, high school, right? One probable reason is that a higher percentage of non-charter high school students were taking CE credits, whereas a higher percentage of charter high school students were earning AP credits, or 2.3% were earning AP credits. So this suggests that a minority of charter high school students may be the ones from early college high schools. So a small percentage of them are earning these credits. And for those who did earn AP and CE credits, they appear to be better prepared for post-secondary education. Now, let's check our definition of post-secondary outcomes, right? So keep in mind that we don't have access to post-secondary education outside of Utah or any private institutions in Utah. So we're looking at USHE enrollment and graduation. So charter high school students had lower enrollment and completion rate, and it may seem like they're not performing as well as their non-charter high school peers. But if we look at the bigger picture of time to enrollment and time to completion, what that tells us is that for charter high school students who did enroll in USHE, remained in a Utah public post-secondary institution, or graduated from a Utah public post-secondary institution, they took shorter time to do those two things. So I don't think it is a disconnect. It is more of a reflection of the missing data for this study, namely the data for out-of-state institutions and private institutions.
Got it. Yeah, great. And then you might have touched on this already, but could you share some of the reasons for why charter students' annual wages are showing to be lower than non-charter students? Do you have any further insights on that?
I think that's an important question to ask. So with the data that we do have, we cannot speculate why charter high school students' average annual wages are lower than non-charter high school students. Remember that we do not have the number of hours worked data. And this may be a reflection of less hours worked or students working in industries that may not be high paying. And also DWS data does not include self-employment, so also we may not be counting charter high school students who are starting their own business. So we would need more data to understand the difference in their wage outcomes. And what's important here is that we see the wage difference between these two groups getting smaller and smaller over time. And what that tells us is that as students spend more time in the workforce, the role of their charter high school attendance play a less and less important role. And that actually is what our intuition would tell us as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, great for thanks for sharing that further. I was also wondering, would the results have changed if you had looked at charter students who attended all grades of a charter high school, or would you expect similar results?
That is a great question to ponder. So, we had attempted to do just that at the beginning, at the very beginning of this study. But unfortunately for us, we were not able to get to early charter high school years because of data quality issues prior to 2012. So in other words, if we wanted to track 12 years of K-12 education, plus about 4 years for the post-secondary education, and then some years for workforce outcomes, we would have needed data from the early 2000s. And it just was not feasible at the time this study was conducted. Now, with that said, just like with any missing data, we're not able to draw any conclusions or speculation of what the findings may have been. So this may be a very good follow-up research in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Might need another 10 years to get that data. But yeah, thanks for explaining that. That is something that you guys tried to do in the beginning. And then just a few more questions and then we'll wrap up. Um, so are these results that you found in your study, are they in line with what you've seen from other states or nationally?
So research on charter high school attendance is very interesting because they really show a mixed result similar to what we were showing here. So some of them are finding that those who attended a charter high school, or some of them were even looking at charter middle schools, had higher test scores in high school, or later on do better in their post-secondary education. Whereas for wage outcomes, there were different findings. So one of them found that those who attended charter high schools were earning less. Another one found that those who attended charter high schools were earning more. So I think it's important to keep in mind as we're interpreting the results, what the limitations are and what the data sources are for each of these research.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. It's great that we have your study now, though, to contribute to the literature and add more to the research about charter schools nationwide. So my final question, so thanks for sharing your study. Could you give us a small preview about your next project that you're working on?
Oh, I'm happy to. Thank you for asking that question. So I'm currently working on a study on the outcomes for STEM students in Utah. So for this study, we're using USHI data to determine who our STEM students are, the courses that they're taking, and their post-secondary outcomes and workforce outcomes. Now, we also use a pipeline approach to look at the points at which we're losing STEM students, maybe to non-STEM majors or maybe to the workforce or otherwise. So,
Yeah, looking forward to it. Okay, well, thank you, Karen, and thank you to everyone who attended today. If you have any further questions, you're welcome to reach out to Karen. Her email is on the screen. So karen.tao@ushi.edu. And again, our report and data narrative is available at udrc.ushi.edu. And if you want to sign up to our email list to learn about future webinars, you can do that at our website as well. So have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you guys at our next webinar.